There we go. Thank you, Brian. And good morning to everybody who's attending. And again, thank you to onOne once again this week for hosting this webinar. And today's webinar is the titled Adding Color, Style, and Fashion to Your Wedding Images. And for those of you who got to see one of the previous ones, we've got some new images to show you how we incorporate the onOne suite and some of the PhotoFrame sections of it to the PhotoTools to enhance your wedding images. So today, that's one of the most exciting things that I get to do is, we all do our wedding photography, or whether you're doing portrait, children photography, etc. But many of us would like to kind of add that little extra wow, as they say, to your images. And so as you see, as I'm kind of thumbing through some of these, we've got some before and after images that I'll take you through. And you'll kind of get to see some of the process of, again, using maybe FocalPoint if you're a fan of onOne right now. Enhancing colors, changing, maybe adding some different background effects, textures, etc. So some of these images, can be start out very simple. So we'll kind of start out from that, and then we'll kind of end up with kind of doing multi-layer effects on images, just to kind of play with that. I think that with today's, and especially in my era with wedding photography, there's a lot of photography kind of emulating each other, the same thing. So I do whatever I can to, certainly as a photographer, to capture the image the first time. Certainly this is not any substitution for a great exposure, a great composition, great photography, but it really just adds that extra bonus. And the way I kind of got so enthused and inspired by this is because when I would sit with our clients, they visit 2 or 3 or maybe 5 different photographers, and they always ooh and ah about the images that I've kind of played with. And so that's what inspired me. Is certainly I love some of the images that are kind of have a more organic and natural look, but in the same token, my clients are kind of impressed when they see images that are kind of, again, some darkening, some just effects that are added to our images, certain enhance of color. So that's what we're excited to do. So this webinar will kind of show you that. I'm going to get out of this section here and take us right directly into Lightroom. Now, first and foremost, just to start here, certainly most of the work will be done obviously inside of Adobe CS5, which obviously holds the onOne suite. So those of you who are not familiar, you'll get to see that here in a couple of seconds. But for those of you who are big fans of the onOne product, this will be a great tutorial for you to show you kind of from the beginning stages how we take our images from one extreme to the other. So I want to start out first of all with pretty much kind of a simple adjustment, so you can see that you don't have to go to extreme with every image that you do. And certainly you can, in fact, let's go back to my raw files here. What I do is certainly I work with raw files. So those of you that have JPEGs or shoot JPEGs only, this certainly works the same way. A lot of us that prefer shooting raw, we like the full color range, the flexibility that raw gives us. So, and that's why generally in Lightroom, we're doing our conversion out to perhaps eventually either to a JPEG. Most labs prefer to work with a JPEG, and so we'll try to touch on that as well. So let me scroll to that image. Of course, I've got tons of images. I know exactly the one I'm looking for here. And again, we'll go starting again from one extreme to the other so that you'll get to see both effects. So here we go. So I'm going to start out with just a head and shoulder image, so that you both can, everybody can see a kind of an idea where this goes, and eventually we'll end up into Photoshop. So here we go. So first and foremost, just give you a little 60-second thing here in Lightroom. Again, all my images are taken in RAW format. We go through Lightroom, and realistically in today's webinar is not about Lightroom, obviously, so we're not going to show you how we can certainly do a lot of enhancements here. But in this case, and in most cases, all my images that come out of Lightroom as a conversion really come out neutral. So if you look over here to the right panel here, really there's 2 things that I really work on as I'm just converting a raw file to a JPEG. So when I give my client, let's say, a set of proofs, the images are pretty neutral. The images you're about to see me create, I don't give that to my clients. I don't show that to them in advance. That's usually the first question I'll get. They'll ask me, what do you show the client, the enhanced version? I don't, and that's something that I say to our clients, that if you want to purchase, whether it's a wall portrait from us or whether you're ready to make a wedding album from us, then those are the effects that are added in those images. but we certainly don't do that in advance. So quick example, if I move to the right here, because I did sneak a couple before and afters, this is a simple one here. Certainly this is the raw image the client would see, meaning I would make a JPEG with not too many enhancements. These colorizations, effects are added afterwards. Once again, this image on the right, it's a portrait studio portrait shot. This is what the client would see, and then once they would order a wall portrait or whatever, then we go through these effects afterwards. So that's usually a big question I get. I never show this to the client in advance. However, once we're ready to print the photo, I usually show them what we did do to the image, obviously, to get their approval. So let's start out with this raw image, and I'll just show you those 2 steps that I kind of really, for the most part, do before, and then we'll take this into Photoshop. Really, I'm always working on color temperature, and I guess the secret to color temperature, certainly you can use this adjustment target tool here and click around. But for me, having had a little more formal background, I understand color temperature. And the days of shooting film, we would pretty much, our roll of film would be around 5,500, if I want to be exact. That's kind of what the color was, film was balanced at 5,500. So in most cases, if it's a sunlight, not fluorescence and tungsten, that works pretty well for me. I don't want any tint to affect my image, okay? And this is certainly a whole little Lightroom section that I could go through in another time. But I make sure I work the color temperature. And what I'm also watching is the whites, by the way. It's another thing I do with my images. I convert, and you'll see why when we add the effects, because certainly I don't want them to be blown out later on. So we keep those, make sure they're white, they're not too yellow with that. Exposure, same thing. I'm exposing for the face, so I'll use that exposure. And if it's usually I am using a handheld meter, so I'm manually on my camera. So that's why if you see this zeroed out, mainly because I am using a meter the day of the event, so I don't have to sit here and go through each exposures. You notice the one last thing is the darkening of the hair. So if in that scenario, if the black is pumped up too high, I know a lot of people love that on their images, I can sometimes take that down. I'd rather have more of a flat image in advance. And the reason I do that is because as I add the effects in the few minutes through the any effects that I add, darkening, lightening, it kind of keeps adding and multiplying on that. I can certainly also use the fill light if I still need a little bit more in the background to open up, but I'd rather have my image neutral, because in a few minutes here you'll see how we're going to add these effects. So really that's the couple quick simple ways. And also let me just comment that I realize there's a lot of us Lightroom power users, and absolutely you can spend 20-30 minutes easily trying to enhance, or less, to add your darkening. You can add color enhancements. You can do quite a few things here. But since I'm providing this image to my client as just a proof, this is how I work in this case, my workflow. I don't do any enhancements at this point. So let's move on. So we're going to go into Adobe CS5. This certainly works in CS4 as well. So whatever version of Photoshop you're working with, this will work for you. So we're now into Photoshop, and what I'll do with any image I'm working on is I will duplicate this image. So you just drag that down to this section here. You'll now make a copy, and you want to do that for a couple reasons. One, if you ever want to lower the opacity of an adjustment, you can certainly lower the opacity here if you want to. And sometimes I'll make 3 or 4 different layers of that same image because I can still change opacities and I can come back and make some adjustments to it. So in this case, we're going to go into it. If you've noticed here, this is probably the most favorite thing that I enjoy about onOne Suite is that it docks here on your panel, and so it's easy accessible for me. I don't have to go into a third party, like to look for backgrounds or load CDs in my computer. This whole process is quick. It's easy. It's very simple. It's all loaded right here, and I have a whole library of options I can work with. So I'm going to start out with PhotoTools first, and what you do is you double-click on that. You'll notice it'll launch in a few seconds into its own window. Here we go. It launched into its own window, and you're going to notice a couple things. I have mine set up on a before and after mode. You can certainly change that viewing option if you prefer just one large single one. But in my case, I prefer to so that I can see what I'm doing in adjustments. But second thing you'll notice is you've got tons of options here. I'm just going to scroll down here. And once again, I always say you're invited to just, even if you do download this as a trial, click on every one of them. That's what I do. I'll click on each one of them. In fact, over on the right-hand side, you've got this great preview. So certainly if you want to, but certainly just, I can go through all day long. I'm clicking around, experimenting, playing with each one of these. And of course, eventually you'll see that I end up making my own favorite. If you go here on the right-hand section here where it says search, and you go here and it says favorites, I'm going to select favorites. And now these are now the ones that I like, the ones that have been flagged. These are the ones that I use more on a daily basis, so I don't have to go through every time, though I still go back and forth because I want to try some of the different effects on the images. So here's how easy it is. I'm just going to click on one quick one here. If I wanted to say add noise to it, all I do is basically double click that. You notice here in the window, it kind of counts that down for you. And if I don't like that, I can hit Command or Control Z, and then obviously brings that effect back. One quick thing here, you'll notice when I add an effect, it's under what's called stack. Right now you have your original. When I add the effects here on the left, you'll notice in a few seconds here they're going to start stacking on it. So the first thing I do with a image like this is I like to smooth the skin out. So you notice here where it says Auto Skin Smoother, I'll double click on that. You'll notice it's counting that down, and you'll notice in a few seconds here that it's going to add the effect onto this image on the right. Okay. The great part is that if you notice now, you've got to almost consider, I guess if you would like to call it a layer as well if you're in Photoshop, but in this case it's stacked because you can add multiple effects on here. You also have this case of adding or fading back and forth. So you notice the effect in there? And that's the great part of this, is that if you want to kind of adjust this accordingly in here, that's your effect. Now if I scroll down this window here, I'm going to keep scrolling down. I've magnified my screen today for you, so that's why I've got to scroll down here for you. You notice here you've got this masking section. This is the great part about this as well, because sometimes I like some parts of my images soft, but I may not want like the eyes, the lips, certain areas. So here's the great part as well. If you go down to the bottom section, you've got these tools. And certainly they do different functions. We'll try to talk about a couple of them here. I'll select a brush tool. You notice now it's activated a brush for me. And you can change the size here, right? You can notice here, if I put it here in the middle, you can notice it'll go up and down. You can use the bracket keys on your keyboard just like in Photoshop to go back and forth. Now, in this section here, you're allowed to either paint out the effect or paint in the effect or erase the effect. So in this case, we want to paint out the effect. So what I will do is I'm going to zoom in into this section here like this. Okay, I'm going to center this for you. And you notice that you've got an opacity as well. So if I know I definitely want 100% of this softness out of her eyes, I'm going to go to 100%, lower my brush down here, and then I will paint out the effect areas that I want to make sure that they're not overly softened. Okay, so sometimes with lips as well, with the retouching of faces, sometimes I'll just hit that smile area. Sometimes there's a little shadow right under the nose. These are little secrets of effects that still will show sharpness. So usually it's the lip line underneath the nose. Sometimes I'll do the eyebrow as well, just to show certain areas that are sharp. And certainly this is all up to your discretion. And but this is how I'll start with softening that. So once again, if you are using a Wacom tablet, you can use the controls from your Wacom tablet by checking these boxes. And that's what I use in the studio. We use a Wacom tablet on these images so I can carefully paint in certain areas. And again, totally up to you where you want to add and subtract these effects. So let's go back to the top. You notice here, same thing. I can still adjust this at any time at this point. You can obviously toggle it on and off if you want to see it, if you don't have this before and after screen. Okay, so let's move on to the next effect. Usually what I like to do is add a little more contrast to this image. Okay, so you have a couple choices here. I've gone through the whole list for you myself, picked certain areas that I like. So in this case, I may want to brush in a little bit. Let's add a little more. Let's see. Let's start with a little detail in here. I'm going to double click that once again. And now it's letting me know. You notice this warning sign that just comes up here says basically the effect you select has been designated to paint in. Any effect down here that has a little brush next to it means that it's going to only apply when you choose your brush tool, and you can only paint this effect in. That's why I left this warning on. So in other words, I'm going to make sure my brush is turned on here down below. Make it a little larger for us in a second so we can see it. Remember, I'm doing it by using the bracket keys, but you can change your brush size here. Okay, and then of course I'm going to zoom in here one more time. Now this time I want to add a little more sharpness to the eyes for me. So I'm back down. Let's go back to the top. You notice it's added to our stack. Okay. Same thing, I can toggle the effect. Right now, I'm going to do 100% so you can see that, but no, you can't see it yet because I haven't brushed it. Make sure that I'm in paint in mode because I'm going to paint in this time. And certainly I did 100% right now just so you can see what it's going to do. So what I'll do now notice what I've done to that. See if it'll let me zoom in one more time. And maybe one more time. There we go. You notice what I've done there? Take a look at now the effects of sharpness of the eyes. And same thing with the bracket key. I'm going to adjust my brush. And for sometimes if you think it's too much effect for you, you can back it off. That's totally up to you. Same thing. I'm going to go back here and you can see the difference on the eyes now. And same thing, if I want to come back and apply it or change that, the opacity, I have that same option of doing that obviously before I'm painting, but here you go. This is the one I'm looking for. This is the one that will let you do it. So if you feel that it's a little bit too much, you can still change that. Okay. Now one quick comment as well. You notice I could probably end up adding many layers as we go along. But the one thing I like to do sometimes is I may do a couple effects. Down here in the lower right, if you hit apply, it'll apply the features back into Photoshop, and I may come back a second time, only because these options that you're doing now will be all kind of all together as one layer when you come back out. But if I want to maintain a certain effect on its own layer, then I'll do usually only one effect at a time. Okay, so this is where you have to do your adjustment if you want to fine-tune. If say you did 4 different effects, you've got to do it here because once it gets into Photoshop, it's all set up in one layer. Okay, so that's just a little hint there as you're doing this. So now that we've got that, you've got the eyes. Now let's say I want to do a little bit of darkening around an image. Okay, I can still stay in here. I'll come down. I like to use the brush because I like to paint in a lot of the effects, and you'll see more and more of that in a few minutes. So if I select this darkening one, it'll come through the same thing. It's saying the same thing. We've got to paint this in. Okay. See, and that's a little secret about these effects. You'll see by the time we're done today is that everything I do is everything is either painted in lightly. It's painted in at 20%, 50% opacity. So I rarely do things globally. I'm always painting things in. So this is the same effect. This is adding a darkening effect. You won't see it yet. I'm going to make sure I'm at 100% just because I want to exaggerate that. Come back down onto your masking tab. Make sure it's paint in. Select the size of your brush, whatever you want to do. Opacity, I'm at 100% because remember with that fader slider, I can do that. And let's say I'm exaggerating this right now. I'm just totally exaggerating just so you can see what it's doing here. Okay, I certainly wouldn't do it this way, but in this case, I want you to see the effect because you know that even if you darken that, you have this option, right? Okay, you have this option right there. But if you want to paint in certain areas and you don't want to do it the whole thing, I can actually come back to this section here. Okay, toggle that on and off. I can hit minus and I just deleted it. Okay, so I'm going to do it again. I'm going to add that darkness. And again, keep the slider here. And usually I may not do everything at 100%. So this one, if I want to slowly do it, this is where I would end up slowly adding the effects in there. Make sure we're in paint in. Okay. Slowly come to that area. Let's make sure we're 100% dark. Okay, and like I said, it totally depends on the areas that you're working at here. Let's go back here. Make sure paint in. There we go. Make sure that we're good. Brush is on. And one of the other things that I mentioned to people as we're doing this is that again, I may not do 4 or 5 at a time, only because I want to come back and make sure that again, if there's an effect that I want to still play with later on, I'll make sure I'll come back into Photoshop. So here's a quick example. I just want to show this so I don't forget. I'm going to erase that. Okay, I like the effects now because I do this a lot because I may not necessarily want to do that 4 or 5 things at one time. So here's where it's taking those 2 effects that I did. It's telling Photoshop, you know, do the darkening first, or in this case we did softening first. We added contrast first, those 2 options, and it's basically knows, you know, what size the image is, and it's applying that for me. So that's why you're seeing both effects in here. And obviously, I made an adjustment layer here myself, a separate layer, and you can see it's creating its own layer. And if you ever click on this, if you want to, let's say, title this contrast and softening, that's a lot of times, if you're doing multiple layers, it's easier to recognize that. Many times when I'm doing things quickly, I may not personally title that myself, but if you are working on an image that has multiple effects, it's usually a good habit to do is to just title it. You just basically click into this little box which we'll do in a second, and you can add that effect in there. So it's telling PhotoTools right now to do that. See, here we go. You've got the effects coming in. It's adding, and then it's obviously going to put them all together for us. So now you're on one layer here. Okay. So see, now that I wanted to bring in is strictly because I can't. If the softening, I did two options to this. I did the softening and some contrast enhancements. It's now put together, right? So here, if you want to double click that, and you can put down basically contrast, and maybe you want to put down soft. Okay, so you'll know what you did there. Okay, so now I'm going to take this image back in there, back in the PhotoFrame, and do that darkening. And now you'll see why I did that. And mainly, hold on one second. Let's go to the PhotoTools. We'll go to PhotoFrame in a few minutes. There we go. PhotoTools. Double click that quickly. And here we go. And it's going to bring us the same image back there, and you're just seeing my little workflow, because now it'll sit on a separate layer when I come back with that. So let's select my favorites. Here's that darkening that I did. I'm going to double click that. I'm going to hit OK. Okay, and now it's going to allow me to paint this in. So same thing, I'm going to go 100% here, and basically come in here. Let me back off. I think I want to do this probably a little bit softer for myself. I want to come in and just slowly paint in certain areas. Okay, just paint in slowly here. And again, remember, you'll notice in a few minutes I can do that there. Okay, and even if I want to play with the opacity a little bit, I can do that as well. I can kind of lower the opacity. All just bringing the attention to the subject right there for us. Okay, so this is just kind of a real basic start. So let's apply it here. Bring it back in, and now you'll notice it's telling Photoshop to darken the edges for me. It's going to create its own layer, and there you go. So now there's your darkening. But here's why I did this on a separate space here, or in this case separate layers, because same thing. I can change now my opacity. Notice that. Just drag in here. You just click and drag on this bar, and if for some reason I did a global, I did it all over the place, then I can obviously click here and make a mask and just come over and grab a brush tool and make sure that the foreground color is the opposite. You toggle back and forth here, make sure it's the opposite of your mask. And so see here at 100%, I'm going to just show you so you can see that. And you can, if you click and hold, you notice it puts little arrows there. That's like it's called scrubbies. That'll let you kind of go back and forth. And then see, I can take certain areas out if I wanted to. Sometimes I'll do some of these effects you'll see in a minute. It's get a little more advanced. You know, I can take out certain areas, open up certain areas. Just exaggerating this for you. So that's the reason we like to do certain things in layers, because if you overstack in that case, you may or may not want to do adjustments. Okay. All right. So let's just do one more effect on here. And this is just a simple effect, just to show you that you don't have to go as extreme as I do some of the other images. Just an everyday workflow, I can soften a little bit, I can add a little sharpening to it. If I want to add a little color to it, same thing. I can come back in. I'm going to merge this layer down. Okay, I just basically, by clicking on here, you can click on that box. You can hit merge down, which I just did, and then just merge that down together. Okay, got rid of that mask for me. I'll do one more effect here. If I come back in and say I just want to add a little more punch to it, and again, everyone asks me, well, how do you know which ones to do? Well, you kind of have a game plan when you go into your images. In other words, I know that I want to soften the skin at times. I know I want to maybe sharpen certain areas. I know I want to tone down. We kind of darken to certain areas, and sometimes I want to add a little color to it. So again, you kind of have to have a game plan in your mind, knowing which effects you want. One last effect here. I usually do one that's called Boost Color. So I'm going to double click on that one. Now this is here another example of where you notice there's no brush next to this one. Well, certainly that's where it's a global effect. Global meaning that it's applied it to the whole thing. And I can tell you that's the number one, whether you want to call it a complaint or you get discouraged when people purchase particular actions and so on, because they do it globally and they're like, well, I don't really like the way that looks. But in my case, I want to do some kind of color enhancements. And let's say in this scenario, see the color on the wall? If I double click that again, watch the color on the wall. It's already applied it. Actually, I may not have to do it again. I can move my slider. See that wall, what it's done back here? Look at the one on the left. If I want to colorize something, may or may not be the skin, because chances are in Lightroom I've already kind of added some skin color. But I can kind of do that here. If I do that again, double click it, it'll add it on top of that again. Now again, look at the background. I'm going to just exaggerate the color in the background, right? I know this is all to everybody's taste. So this is the beauty of this, is that when you know that you're not worried about the global, you're just worried about maybe enhancing the background, the walls, the flowers in this case on her ear. Same thing, I can come in here, grab my brush down here below. See, it's got paint out, and obviously we want to get rid of that on her face, okay? So you certainly have that option of removing, you know, whether it's the color, except you want to move that off the image. Even I want to move that off the veil so I can get rid of some of that cyan cast. Okay, so you have to kind of be careful where you over-exaggerate that in certain areas, right? Same with this section, okay? So I keep stacking these one on top of each other, but knowing that in this scenario that I've boosted it twice, okay? So I'm adding more color to it. And again, if you want to, in fact, let me back up for a second. Let me get rid of this top layer. Just want to show you something here. And I started out with this layer already. So chances are I would probably remove this one first, okay? Hit paint out. And I'd probably do this first because you notice that when I duplicated it, I've got to remove some of this here, because if not, it's going to keep adding to it. So I've got to watch myself when I do that, because I can keep adding effects and I don't want it to. So there we go. But you notice the background looks great. Now let's go back and try that same effect, okay? Let's do that one more time. Let's go back up to the top. That's the original layer. Let's double click that boost color one more time. It's going to go global on me again, and let's do the same effect. Let's enhance the background, adding more color. And then the last thing we'll do is the same thing. We'll paint that back out. So you got to make sure to do it on each layer. Sometimes I work so quickly that I end up having to go back again. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. You want to. That's what makes you do a different trial and error. If I just hit into that flower, I want to come in and paint some of that back in. You see, you still got that freedom. So now when I hit apply, this will now tell Photoshop to enhance the colors that we've selected. You'll notice in front of the screen it's going to apply it globally. It's being so creative that it's telling Photoshop, it shows it the mask. So a lot of things go down in the background. So let's click out of your way, and there you go. So if you basically toggle before and after, you can see a simple effect right there. Pretty much is a very simple effect. So that's a very easy way of making enhancements, again, on a daily basis. You don't have to get too creative and going overly creative with some of the effects. So let's move on to another one. Let's get a little bit more intricate into this. I just like to start with a basic thing. PhotoTools has been great because it has a lot of great effects, but I think the secret to this is to, once again, know in advance where you want to do darkening, where you want to do lightening. Do you want to add color, subtract color? Of course, in Photoshop, I can do certain things, techniques, which I guess I have to at least show you something. So, you know, if I want to remove certain casts later on, that's why I want things in layers. I can come in here, I can do an adjustment, let's say on the hue and saturation. If I grab this target adjustment tool, select the blue part in there and go to the left here, you notice it pulls those colors out. Okay, so that's another little secret Photoshop tip that I work on to maybe get rid of that what you just saw right now. I'm going to toggle that on. You see kind of that bluish cyan cast. So when you do vignetting and darkening on bridal gowns and whites, you'll end up getting that cyan blue cast. So that's my little secret tip there, that you can come into this adjustment panel, grab that little target adjustment tool. It's T-A-T, target adjustment tool, and select the color, drag left to remove it, and right. So a little quick tip there. I had to throw that in there, guys. So hang on there with me. So let's exit out of this one. Once again, if you have any questions, you can text those over or message those over to Brian. And let's get over to something a little bit more advanced now. Let's go back into Lightroom. And let's select another photo. Let's pull up an engagement photo. Let's go over here to the right. There we go. And I hope you guys are all making notes because there will be a test. And of course, I'm just kidding. All right, here we go. So, all right, let's select this image right here, an engagement photo. Okay, and same thing applies here. In this particular case, this is the image right out of the camera. The couple tips that I gave you earlier about my adjustments, I want to keep them neutral. I guess if you study the differences in color temperature and etc., you'll notice that obviously as the day gets colder, the lighting is colder, you can certainly boost up that. So I know I said I'm at 5500 with daylight, but if you are in heavy shaded area, you will end up being somewhere 6,000, 6,500, 7,000 degrees as they call it. So don't be afraid to do that. If you hit the Y key in Lightroom, I know I do a lot of shortcuts, you can kind of see a before and after of what you're doing. But what I said in the beginning is I want to keep it neutral. I'm not finishing this image in Lightroom at all. I'm just keeping it neutral for my clients, so I'm not going to go down to the rest of the tabs and accelerate vibrance and that. I want to show my client for a sales reason. I want to show them the neutral one, because if you made it the proof, so to speak, the JPEG that you convert out here looks so great, then they're thinking, well, just give me the CD of all the photos. I can probably have them printed myself. But if I can show them a before and after of my images, then in that case they say, wow, how do we get that? And obviously they have to purchase an enlargement or photo from us. So let's do this couple quick things we did earlier. We make sure the color temperature looks appropriate. I make sure I have no tint affected in this. Same thing, exposure. I use a handheld Sekonic exposure meter, so you can see usually my exposures are pretty much right on. The darks, I check with the darks in here to make sure the darks aren't, as obviously too dark. And that's it. So I'm going to convert this back into Photoshop by right-clicking on it. We're going to edit it back in Adobe Photoshop. Okay, let's open this up. And let's do a few of the same steps. In this case, we're going to do a couple more steps here. We're going to just add a little color and enhancements in PhotoTools. And then secondly, we're going to show you what we do in PhotoFrame to kind of add a little more depth to this image. Okay, so first off, like we did earlier, let me just take this out of the tab mode. And if any of you are Photoshop users, you don't like that to dock in this, you see how it starts turning a little color. You can go into your preferences and turn this off. So if you like the way it is in CS4 and older versions, you can turn that off and doesn't dock your image. So let's start out with what we normally all do is we'll come down, drag this down and duplicate the layer. So whatever adjustments we do here, we can still make other adjustments. And let's go back into PhotoTools. Let's add, in my scenario, let me back up for a second. If you go over here to this, I'm doing this for myself, so you don't have to make a note of this here. I'm going to grab this pencil tool just for my own teaching for you, so don't worry about this. What I'm going to do is, in traditional Lightroom days, let me make another copy here because I'm going to throw this away. What I meant earlier about what would we do this effect. I know years ago, before digital, we would print a 4x6 photo, and we say, you know what, we'd look at the print, I'd get a grease pencil, a black or a white grease pencil, and on my 4x6, before the digital, I would say, you know what, I want to darken this area a little bit, right? That's what I would tell the lab because they would have to custom print, maybe darken a little bit here. If I want to dodge, we would use circles. Let me make sure I change my color so you can see this. Hold on. So just give you a little 60-second tip here, guys. So I would tell my lab, you see anywhere that there is, hold on, wherever I put circles, these are the dark areas, quick example, I would probably dodge. This doesn't have too many dark areas. But in most cases, I would say, you know what, I want to tone down these bright windows. So this is the communication I would do. I might want to kind of darken this area a little bit. I want to darken around here. I want all the attention to kind of come over to this couple. And so in my mind, I don't really make these drawings, but for you, I'm sharing this with. But I used to draw these on my image. Anywhere I had the darkening like this, and it kind of would be more like hash marks like this, we tell the lab we want you to burn and dodge this area. Okay. And then I would say to them, you know what, on the background, I want to enhance color for the background. I'm trying to draw here with my pen. So you make little notes. But in this case, since you're doing it yourself, you're still in your mind, you can go through this and say to yourself, what do we do to the images? I think that's one of the biggest questions I get is, well, Frank, how do you know what to do to this? Well, I analyze my images before I get into here. And some of these are pretty much consistent image to image. But some of the effects are out here, you'll see that it's kind of just as I go along. So I'm going to remove this because obviously this was demonstrations. And let's go and add color. Let's do what we just talked about. Let's go into PhotoTools. Double-click PhotoTools. It'll launch that and back in here. Once again, I went through, selected my favorites. And now, again, if I want to add, let's say, a little detail, or in this case, I want a little punch to it, I'm going to double-click this. Once again, it's a painting option for us. So at 100%, I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier, check the opacity, and I'm adding basically a little punch. This is kind of like a little punch, adding a little contrast. You notice when you add some little contrast, it's adding a little color. Now I do use a Wacom tablet to paint in, so I'm doing this rather quickly for you guys. So I do invite you to take your time, enlarging it a little bit. If you're, again, using that, you can get in there real fine. I do take my time and go through around the sections, okay? And again, I'm just doing this rather quickly. So I would go through there. I'd literally make the brush smaller, go through here, and very quickly, and it's very easy to do. And again, if I want to duplicate this effect again, as we did earlier, I can come in, I can double click it again. Remember, we're back here under our stack section, so if I really still want to add more detail to that, I can do that as well. Now, if I'm happy with that effect, I can come down here and let's add a little color. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to see boost color. It just added the global coloring, remember, all over the people. So in that scenario, you ask yourself, do you want to remove that off of the faces, which in this case, I want to paint out. You notice that I've got under masking paint out. I don't want her to look like she has too much of a tan. And again, I'll vary the brush size. The other thing, since I do a lot of wedding gowns, I'm always making sure I'm getting rid of this in that section, okay? Always making sure that it's off the whites. Again, any skin color, you don't want to over-exaggerate it, because as you keep adding effects, some effects will affect the last effect, if that makes sense. So you don't want to keep having colors added, especially when you're adding colors, keep adding on top of each other, because you'll end up with a really over red of skin tone. That doesn't look good either, okay? So that's how I'll apply this and just add some more colors to there. Now, remember we talked about adding some darkening to this. We talked about I wanted to share with the lab how to darken that. Same thing, I can still stay in the same thing. Let's go back up on top. If I want to add it to the stack, I can. If I want to come back later, I'll hit apply below. Remember what I did earlier and come back? I can do either one, depending on my adjustment. So in this particular case, I want to add a little darkness on this one. I won't go so crazy yet. Just add a little darkness. Let's paint a little darkness in for this. I'm going to be at 100% just because I want to see the full effect. And maybe we'll go down about close to 50% because I just want to slowly paint that in. Select the brush size and just a little bit around the corners, okay? Because later on you'll see I'm going to add some more at the end. I'm going to add a little bit, one more effect on here. So I'm just kind of adding just a little bit of toning to this to bring the effect to this. Just kind of, and our whole purpose of this, by the way, why I do a lot of darkening, is because basically the rule of thumb is when you look at an art piece, whether it's a painting, a graphic design, in this case we're photographers, you know, the number one thing that, and one of the top things that as an artist, you want the viewer to bring their eye to where you want them to go. So sometimes if it's a high key, it's an ocean photo, obviously I may not darken, I may lighten it because that's the subject, but in this case I want the viewer to look right at my subject matter. So that's one of those rule and art theories, is that you want the viewer to be able to see what you want them to see. So in this case, if this is so bright up here, then your viewer is kind of having to bounce her eye. Is this door maybe too bright? Is the sidewalk too bright? Where does my eye go to? So in this case, that's where I want the viewer to go. Okay, so I would normally do that, and I'm going to hit apply. And I hope you see how easy this is. This is what makes this whole process, because you know, I know you're asking yourselves, well, I could probably do this in Photoshop. I could probably do some of this in Lightroom, and I know we all can, but here's the deal. Here's the real deal, if you guys are with me here, that I want to do this quickly, and I also want to do this consistently. And what the reason is that if I build an engagement album like this, this couple may purchase 30, 40 images, and I may put this in an album for them. Or if it's a wedding album, I'm selling anywhere from 80 to 100, 150 images in a wedding album. Now, I'm not saying that I'm adding this effect to 100 pictures in the album, but if I want to add 5 or 6 effects, or even on the same page, there's 3 or 4 of the same images, I can duplicate this because of these tools. These tools have already been pre-made for me, so I don't have to go back in Photoshop and go under all my adjustment panels up here and try to recreate this every time. Not all of us are savvy with making actions and want to spend the time to make actions. So this is the number 1 or 2 reasons I enjoy using this. It's quicker, it's easier, like everything is right in their library, so everything's right in Photoshop for me. I don't want to leave Photoshop, I want to do it all here. So this is the major purpose of this. Okay, so let's add one more effect on here. So if you guys are hanging in there with me, here's that layer you see is return the results of the color we've added, the little sharpness we've added, the detail in the background, and a little darkening. So now I want to kind of add a little grunge to this. I do a lot of texture overlays, so if any of you are into that, once again I'm going to duplicate this layer because this gives me the option that eventually if I do make it with effects, I have one more option here in my layers panel to lower the opacity. So let's go back into the final program, which is PhotoFrame 4.6. I'm going to double click that once again. Now for me, this is a candy store, okay? This is where there's so many options for me here. If you've downloaded this trial, I invite you to go through each one. I mean, I literally have clicked. If you notice all the options here on the items that you should see on the left, I've clicked through all these numerous times because it's very overwhelming. You're saying, oh my God, do I want a background? What do I want to do to these images? Okay, so that's where I get my inspiration as I go through these and say, wow, look at all these cool effects I can add on there. I mean, look at this one. I mean, I'm just looking at this in front of me. I'm getting inspired. This is called an acid burn. I mean, it just adds, look at what it's doing to the windows. So it's as easy as this. You select it, you hit add frame, and it'll render the results back right on top. As you notice here on the edges, you'll see this. It's added this effect on the edges. Now, if I don't like that, I want to go back again. I can see it's almost like you've got your own layers, but we call it stacks. You can hit minus and go back and open the library. Okay. So usually if I add a frame, by the way, I'll add the frame usually at the very end if I'm going to go to print with it. But in this case, I want to add a little texturizing to the wall, a little grunge. So as you've gone through here, I can use any feature in here. Some of the gurus that they have actually built that have some great effects in here. They've built a section here with your texture overlays. And I invite you to click through each one. If you click on them, just say there's architecture. I know most of us would run to the scratch film quickly, but I use most of these different ones. This one is saying there's an architecture effect, and you can look through there. And I kind of know that if I picked any of these effects, and I'm just picking this in front of all of you. I haven't decided which one I want to use because I use quite a few of them. I can go through here and look at these, and your first thing is, well, let's see this one in the middle, this texture one. Well, I can't see the people. Well, you know we can paint that out, but I know that I can come in and just hand choose anything I want out of it. This one obviously may have a little more pattern than I want, but as I just invite you to click through these, and you can just click through these and decide maybe which one do you want. I mean, there's so many choices, just depending on the one that you like. I did one yesterday during my demonstration with perfect layers, and I did like an ocean scene. Some of these are a little bit harsh for that, so I went in and used the paper. And you can't see it here. You do, however, have an option of going with a white overlay. So that is easily changed for you there. And I use this a lot of more of my high key images. So you have that option right here in PhotoFrame. If I keep it black, you have to look closely. I can probably see it on my screen a little clearer, but you go through here. But I'm going to pick on this architecture one because I like some of this really hard grunge look on here. Okay. In this case, I'm going to select this one, and all you do is you can either double click it, or you can select add frame. Very easy. Now you notice it's returned the result right on top of this, and you have a couple controls here. First and foremost, you have your blend layers that you have in Photoshop. Okay, so you can actually see this in front of you before you've actually taken it into Photoshop. So if you prefer to wait to do your blend modes in Photoshop, you have that option, but at least you can see what that effect is. So if you don't like what it's doing, you can certainly go back up here in the top section. Make sure you selected it, hit minus, it'll delete it, and then hit open library and then go find something else. That's your option. Or you can even lower your opacity here. And you remember I made a duplicate layer in Photoshop, so I have that option, but I also have this as a backup as well. But usually I do everything either 100% or at 5 or 10%. I'm not sure, but I know that in my Photoshop I've made that little backup as a layer, so I have that kind of as my backup. So here you have also option of blurring the effect. There's sometimes I'll do that with clouds in the sky. If it looks too fake to me, I'll blur it out. I've even added some noise to certain effects, kind of gives it a little noise to that, etc. So you can play with this. You can even change the color of these as well. So if you're doing kind of like a brownish tone, you can change the different effects here. You can come and click on here. You can click basically in any of these sections if you want to be creative with some of your effects. Okay. I usually just leave it like that. And all I have to do is hit apply. And what this is going to do, it's going to tell Photoshop to resize this overlay, this texture overlay, resize it to my file size. You don't have to sit there and be a mathematical wizard here. It'll resize it. Photoshop does it by itself. And the beauty of this, here you go, is it's sitting on its own layer. Okay, that's what we're talking about in the sense of a very editable type of enhancement. So it's got its own layer. Remember we talked about blend modes? I can do the same thing here. I can just drag down this menu, take a look at it, I can click on those, and it gives me the right one. Hold on one second, let me make sure I'm on the right layer. I'm on the image. There we go. Now I'm on the texture. So I can actually select any of these at that point and still make the changes. So if I like that effect, that overlay, I like that because I kind of pumped up my windows, then all you do is come down to the bottom of this layers panel. You see we're still in that layer. Go ahead and select your mask option and make sure you select your brush tool back on this section and make sure we're in here. You're going to hit your brush tool. Okay, I selected a pencil earlier, so I had to make sure I went to brush. And make sure that you notice your mask is white. Make sure your foreground color here on your left side is black. Okay, you can toggle back and forth. If you hit the X and X-ray on your keyboard, that toggles both. Now I can come in here. You notice your opacity. In this case, here's what I like to do. In this scenario, I never start at 100%. I'll show you why. Because if I come in at 100%, it's going to be too obvious for me. Okay, it's going to be too obvious. So a lot of times, if I back that out, I may start at 50%, 20%, and I'll start working from the subject. Let me zoom in here. I start working with the subject because eventually the subject will be at 100%. So I select 100%. Eventually the faces, the skin, especially, will always be at 100%. Okay, because you don't want any type of texture on their faces. On the shirt, I obviously don't want to make it look like he's purchased an old shirt, so I may come up here and go 50%. So you have plenty of options of adding your effects. So same thing, that's why I use these Wacom brushes in the tablet, because I can go in here and slowly change the brush size. And I'm doing this quickly here, but you can slowly change that out. As again, if I'm painting around. So I do spend, in some of these images, I do spend a little bit of time. I'm not afraid to say that I will spend as much time as it takes to do these enhancements. I know a lot of people say, well, it takes forever, it seems like it takes a while. Well, you know, I started out with just that first one I showed you, just making it real simple. But as I try to be a little more creative and I'm having a little more fun, I think there's nothing wrong with having fun with this, guys. You want to be able to experiment. If I get out of control here, I can hit the X key, change the foreground background color, paint back in. Okay, again, I'm just doing this kind of quickly. And just paint that out. Very simple. Okay. And remember what I said earlier about the opacity of this? If I think it's still too strong for me, okay, I can just paint it quickly. If it's still too strong, I have that option here. Okay. I still have that option of bringing that down a little bit so it doesn't look so bad. And I still will come back. Here's another thing that I'll do. Same thing as I said earlier. I'll come back at 20, 30%, enlarge my brush here, and just slowly take things out. But the secret for me is I'm doing this at a very low opacity, okay, even around the couple, so that, you know, you're painting. Here's another little secret that I talk about with people. If you're painting around it to get some of this off, if you do a larger brush, because remember I want the attention to come to their faces, if you do a larger brush like this and you're at about 10%, and you select, or 20%, it'll just softly take that around them. You won't see that where you painted out. Had you gone to start using little brush size around here, you'll start seeing ghosting when you're around the people. So if I put a big brush around them to remove some of these effects, it's a little softer effect around them. It's still it's adding like a vignette effect of the opposite approach here. And then once again, I'll just look at the image. If there's anything else that I want to do, same thing. So I've kept, because I went to overlay mode, sometimes it'll be normal, sometimes it'll be hard light. You just choose any option you want. But basically that gives me that effect on there. And there's one last effect many times, two more things that I do actually. Many times as I come back here, you'll notice it's on its separate option here. Now here's another tip that I do on my workflow. Let me just stop for this second. Is that if I'm to the stage where I'm now, and I'm happy with it, but I know in my mind that I want to do a couple more things to it, I will purposely at this point save this as a PSD. Okay, I'll stop what I'm doing. I'll come up to the File menu, and I'll hit Save As, and make sure that I save it as a PSD. Because what I'll do is if I like this now, I can come back and bring that image in. But a lot of times if I keep adding and adding and adding to it, and I maybe went overboard, I can't come back and redo it. I don't like to overstack my layers. only mainly because if you ever get a notice in front of your screen saying that an unexpected error has occurred, we've all had that happen, then there goes all your work that you did to it. So I would literally stop what I'm doing, save this as a PSD, and by the way, before I do that, I would probably do this. I would hit duplicate. That's exactly what I'd do. Here's my duplicate, okay? This background one is still in layers, and I would close this, and then I would save this, okay? I'd save this on your desktop, wherever you want. That's a PSD. You saved it untouched. And then this one now, so that I can maybe start and do another version of this, adding that is, I would literally flatten this item because I'm already happy with it. If I need to come back to it, I'll go grab that. And then again, by just coming down here, making a duplicate and adding maybe one or two more effects, let me just do that for us. I'll come back into PhotoFrame. So I just want to add a little bit more effect to this. I want to add a little more darkening to it. I think those of you who've seen some other webinars know that I'll still add some more effects. I don't like anything to look like it's just a single effect. And I like to do like a little more vignetting, a little more clouds effect. So if I want to make it look more dramatic, I use a lot of these clouds. So this is a very quick step. So if you go in here, I'm going to select this top one. It's hard to see them on top yet. And you're kind of seeing this cloud effect on here. It's just kind of adding that on there. And what I'll do is same thing. I won't mess with any of these sections here. I'll hit apply one more time. It's going to return the result on the proper size of your file. It'll put it on a separate layer. And I'll show you the only little difference I will do in this one is I'm going to actually paint this whole thing. Okay, so now here's the last step on here. You notice that it's did the same thing, right? It's added our texture on there. We're good with that. But what I like to do in this scenario is that I will put a mask that I did earlier, okay, and I'll put a white mask. Now I want to usually invert this mask, okay? I invert this. If you highlight the white mask and I come back here to invert, you'll notice that it's not highlighted, right? So don't panic, because if you do the shortcut to invert that mask, whoops, hold on a second, just lost that photo. There we go, okay, is Control or Command I as in India. Control or Command I on this mask will switch that to a black mask. So that's one of my favorite shortcuts. So what I've done now, I'm going to back out again, is I don't want it to be global in this case. Remember, I can paint out like I did earlier. I can do that as well. But that may take me sometimes more work. So I'll do Control or Command I, and with my brush, grab your brush tool here, B on your keyboard for brush. Here's where I'm going to same thing. I may go whatever effect I want. I'm at 100% because I'm trying to darken. In this case, I will just kind of come in here. Let's make sure we're on that layer. Make sure the foreground color is white. Toggle that here on your tools. And then I can come in and just intermittently paint those clouds wherever I want. Okay, you see that? So it almost looks like it's patchy there. So why I would do this using a cloud or a texture effect like this is because it looks more realistic when it's adding. It's almost like a modeled sponge. Have you ever seen a painter paint a canvas? Sometimes they'll use certain sponges. With that cloud is giving me that effect. And if I just took the brush on its own, even though I soften the roundness of the brush, it still looks too fake for me. It's too round. So in other words, let me see if I can show you this demonstration. You don't want to do this, but I just want to show you. Let's go back into PhotoFrame. Let me see if it'll let me show you on that white mask. If not, I'll make a blank one for you. Let me see if it pulls up white for us. Okay, see, I just pulled in the white. I'm just doing this for demonstration. I want you to see that texture that I pulled in right there. That's the clouds that I brought in. Remember what you just saw? Because you couldn't see it on top of the image, so that's what I just brought in. So you can see I've even used any of these. The difference between using, this is kind of a black and white one. If I hit the cloud one, it's going to add a little blueness to it. So I either have to desaturate that later, or I prefer to use this one because now it's already black and white, and when I get back in there, it's not going to add those colors for me. So I'm just going to close this because this was just for just to show you why I like that cloud effect on there. And I've used this with any of the other ones. I've used some of the artistic media. I mean, I've used some of the wood. I used several ones. So there you go. So that's your image from basically, let's see if I can find the original for us. Let's see, we can show that to you guys. Because remember, there will be a test. We expect you guys to all do this right away. And let's see if I can pull that single image out. Oh, I think it's in Lightroom. Let's show it to you in Lightroom. Go right here below. Okay. And let's click into Lightroom. No, I didn't want iPhoto. Sorry, guys. That never happens, right? Okay, so here we go. So there's that image right there. Okay. So you can see basically the before and after of that. Okay, and if I can actually put those together and hit the compare mode in Lightroom. So there's your image there, left and right. So that's how I keep building it. It's the secret to a lot of these enhancements are realistically where you're doing knowing in advance, like I sketched for you, what you want to do with certain images, knowing where you want to apply it, painting them in. And probably the last, let me do one more effect, guys. Let's do one more thing. The last effect that I'll do some of these images in Photoshop using the suite is, again, so in this scenario, here's another habit that I have, one more quick thing, is I'll save this as a PSD and I'll call this maybe clouds and darkened. Okay, I'll save this as a PSD again, because in my mind right now I have another effect that I want to do and I may not want that on this. So I'll save this and I'm going to show you what I did earlier. This is my habit because I don't know which one I like yet, so I make several copies. I'm making a duplicate first. That's the one I'm going to work on last, one last thing, guys. And I'm going to save this. Okay, I'm going to hit save. And I'll title it, again, I'll title this dark with clouds. Okay, everyone I do title that every time, so I know what I did to my effect. The other one just said soften, darken, contrast, whatever you named that. You hit OK. And then this last one, here we go. So a lot of times if I want to use one of my favorite ones, and the last one I'll show you here is very simple, very easy step, is I use the FocalPoint. And so that gives you kind of that blurring effect in certain parts of your image. Here we go. Now remember, I'm going to start from scratch because I already know I have my PSD. So I'm starting from scratch because I'll have different layers and masks and I don't want to confuse myself. I'll make a copy. I just hit Control-Command-J. It's just by dragging down here as well. And the last effects, on some of them, not all images, I'll go to FocalPoint. I'm always using PhotoTools. I'm always using PhotoFrame. And FocalPoint I use quite a bit. If I want to just add just a little effect, usually I'll do this with either black and whites. And this is awesome here. This is probably definitely one of my favorite ones ever. I can use this spider bug, as they call this here, to basically go in and out and adjust this, okay? And you notice what it's down below. It's added as I kind of bring this in and out. This is how it comes in default. If you want to use a round one, you notice right now that this is when I click on this, you notice that it's kind of elongated, it's kind of square as they call it, or in this case it's planar. You can do round. Now I don't really use this one effect because I kind of like it more of kind of that cross effect on this, so I usually stick to this one. And then you can obviously, using by these handles, you can adjust the effect. Do you want the windows like this? Do you want the bottom of this here? So you kind of choose which one you want. Now, let's say you have a couple options here to certainly feather it more so that the blend between the sharpness and that, you have that option. Okay, so you can adjust with that. You obviously have an adjustment level here, so if you want to increase the opacity, you can do that here. But the great thing about, once again, with onOne, let's say I leave this at default. Same thing here, you can use these tabs here. You've got each corner to make adjustments on vignetting, etc. You've got several tools. I invite you to kind of go through this as well. But what I love about this, even though there's certain areas I may want to bring back to attention, let me make sure their faces aren't as well there. It'll bring it back. I'll hit apply. And what it'll do is it'll bring it back into Photoshop. We're not working in Lightroom. I just brought Lightroom up just to show you the before and after. But here's the last step. You notice that in this case I've got a duplicate layer here underneath you. That's the number one reason you've got a layer, is that if I want to add that mask, same thing. With your brush tool, with the foreground color being the opposite, I have the same thing. As I can come in, make sure that I'm at 100%, and I can paint out those effects as well. So if it's too, you can notice I exaggerated that. See that if it's too much blur for you, you can change that. If you want to just take it out and whatever you want, just a little bit slower effect, you can do that a little bit. Sometimes I'll play with this. I'll just cut through certain areas just to kind of give it a different effect. Obviously, I'll take it off of them if I did overbleed over them, but there you go. That gives me your effect. And it's same thing. It's soft in here. Background looks great. I kind of spotted a little bit here. I want things to kind of look a little bit like it's not so predictable. And there you go. That gives you an image of where we went from just a simple image to enhancing colors, adding textures, adding layers. Again, I invite you to download the trial if you're not using it already. Click through all of them, and in your mind, just understand that if there's an effect that you're not too thrilled, you can just paint that in. You can paint stuff in and out, and that's how I constantly create new effects every day, and literally every day I'm creating new effects. And with the library that's in the onOne suite, it allows us to do that. Yesterday, one last note, we were previewing Perfect Layers, and eventually, I believe in the summer, Perfect Layers allows us to provide additional effects into with Lightroom, and that'll soon be coming in your onOne suite. And Brian will probably tell a little bit about that. But if there's any questions, you can certainly ask Brian. I'll stay on the line for a few minutes if all of you have any quick questions, but I want to thank all of you for once again hanging in there with me. I try to bring in new images every time I'm in, and like today, I'll just, on the fly, I can just create whatever effects I want. So thank you for listening. Brian, once again, thank you, and I'll stay on the line for a few minutes for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Frank. I wanted to ask, there was a question that was asked in terms of, with shooting RAW versus JPEG, with RAW, do you find that you need to do any color management? Like, you use Lightroom to manage your RAW files. Do you do any color management? And do you find that a RAW file is, the color in a RAW file is consistent as it's displayed in Lightroom or some other product
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sorry, guys. I don't mean to interrupt. My microphone was actually, I had it flipped up over my head.
Maybe repeat the question. Repeat the question this way they can all hear it too, maybe.
Yeah, sure. The question was, and I apologize, everyone. The question was between JPEG and RAW. And so, Frank, you work in RAW. Do you do any color management with Lightroom, and also do you notice any differences in color management in general if you shoot RAW versus JPEG?
Wow, that's a great question, and I'm going to try to give you a short answer with that, because that's a huge question, and there's different ways to go with this. But I think that, I guess, two quick things. Number one, let's say you shoot in JPEG in your camera. I mean, certainly you can make some adjustments to that image later, but when you're shooting with JPEG in your camera and you notice your camera has some adjustments in the menu, right? You can add sharpness, you can add contrast, you can boost color, you can go through the camera's menu and do all that stuff, and that effect only works if you're shooting RAW. I'm sorry, if you're shooting JPEG, because you're asking your camera to apply these, as they call, effects to the JPEG file. Well, when you shoot RAW, at this point, other than maybe a little color bounce on the back of the camera, I use mine basically, and I'll tell you in a second, on a color temperature. I usually set my camera like at 5,000 Kelvin temperature on the back. Just like when I would put a roll of film in the days of film. The roll of film that I put in there was basically 5,500 temperature. That's daylight film. That's exactly what the film did. There was no variance in trying to go back and forth and and play with that. So, but you can also leave your camera on auto white balance. But the bottom line is that you're either asking your camera to process the photo, or you're letting yourself, whether your Aperture or Lightroom, process that file. So when you're in RAW format, realistically, it's not saying that you're going to get a better color. It just opens up all these other options for you. And some of these features not maybe everyone works in a JPEG, but you're having an uncompressed format, so you have more color space, more density range in a RAW file, and we're trying to create a very non-destructive. So if you ever do so much work on an image and it's a JPEG, you'll start seeing like banding, like lines through here, artifacting, deteriorating of a file. That's because it's a compressed file, and you limited the color space and color range and even density range by using a JPEG. So those of us that shoot RAW, the memory nowadays is cheap. That was the only reason we considered using shooting JPEG in the early days, is because we thought, oh my God, who wants to buy a card to hold all those RAW files? But memory's cheap, so we shoot RAW. That's what the camera's meant to shoot. And if you don't mind, here's I guess one other key thing: if you don't mind doing your own post-production, which I love doing. I know I hear other photographers think that it's a waste of time, that's up to your workflow, but it's very simple. If you shoot with a light meter, you'll notice your exposure meter, remember what I said earlier, is very consistent, less work to do. All I have to do in certain areas is I can either pick one temperature and sync, and let's say these images on the right, all these images were the same light setting, same exposure, I just sync it quickly. So if you have JPEGs, it just limits what you're doing. But certainly, your color, which is a whole different topic, is not affected necessarily JPEG or RAW, but you have more options in RAW, way more options.
It's true. It's true. You can do true custom white balances in RAW where you really
Correct.
can't do that in
Yeah.
JPEG.
Yeah.
And it's also uncompressed RAW. And I remember actually, Frank, you were talking. I kind of was smiling. I remember way back in the day when digital SLRs first came out. And then you're right, the removable media storage was very expensive. And you know how all of you guys with digital cameras, when you change your format from RAW to JPEG, it shows you the amount of exposures that you have left, and it would like quadruple. I'm like, well, there's no way I'm going to shoot in RAW if I can only get 15 exposures versus 100. So now it's not even, Frank said, it's almost, there's no excuse to shoot JPEG unless you need to get a higher burst rate with your camera if you're a sports photographer or something. But that's totally circumstantial. All right, Frank, I think I got most of the questions. There was a question, and this is just in general, is there a possible way to create textures and add them to your frames library? That was by Eric. Yeah, Eric, you can. I'm a big fan, actually. I do this a lot. Is I just use I have an iPhone 4, and that has an excellent camera. And what I do is I actually, if I'm ever walking somewhere and I see a cool texture, I'll just take a picture of it with my phone, or if I have my camera, I'll take my camera. If you go to the onOne website and go to the PhotoFrame videos, I recorded a video that shows you how to get those textures into the library so you can use them with PhotoFrame. And so I see a few other questions. Can these webinars be downloaded? Absolutely. The only way you could download them is through the iTunes podcast channel. I can show you how to get to that. And let's see, will Perfect Layers require Lightroom for full functionality? Absolutely not, Ron. Perfect Layers is a standalone product, so you can use it currently in Aperture, you can use it in Lightroom, or you can use it by itself. Kim's wondering, Frank, how long have you been a commercial wedding photographer, and how hard was it to get started?
Well, the short answer to that is I've started 30 years ago. So, and I worked for 4 different studios in my beginning of my career. Of course, I went to school for photography, but I worked for 4 different photography studios, and so that really helped a lot too. I know nowadays, talking to photographers, there's a little bit more accessibility to become a photographer. The digital camera certainly has helped. You can go to people's website and kind of emulate what they're doing. Websites are very inexpensive, but when I started, basically, there was no digital. I mean, we had to learn exposures, we had to learn composition, we had to learn basically, how to use all the apertures, shutters, what those things would do, what the certain lenses would do. I had to, in fact, a lot of the skills that I'm showing you today come from me doing darkroom work. I used to print black and white, and I used to print color, from mixing the chemicals to processing, burning, dodging. Years of print competition has helped me. I invite anybody who's serious about their work, if you join like your local associations, they have print competitions, print critique. That's how you learn, by seeing how these photographers will show you how they've either darkened, enlightened, and enhancements. You're really learning. We all know these tools. We all can click through the tools. So I always feel that when I demonstrate, I'm not really here to necessarily show you how to work Lightroom or show you how to use onOne Suite. I'm really trying to show you as a full-time studio. We do probably 50 to 60 weddings per year, and we're doing it every day. As soon as I hang out with you guys, I'm working on another project. So we're in the trenches here and doing this, and that's why the onOne software has helped us, because I'm not the only one in my studio. I have 2 other people doing the production. So without them trying to be a Photoshop guru, time is money. So I want them to do this quickly and easy. So I invite you to learn your craft of photography. As I said in the very beginning, what I do has no, the photography comes first for me. That's my first passion, is creating great images. And what I do to these images is really just the icing on the cake. I mean, it's, again, as I first started by saying, this is not a substitution for your photography. It's merely just adding that extra spice to it and getting better sales for me. I mean, this is really boils down for me as making more money, making higher sales, getting the clients excited about what you do. And especially today, everybody's a photographer. So if your work looks the same and you're copying everybody's work on the internet, that's what they're choosing from. So if I can show a client, I don't know if you can still see my screen.
Yeah, you can.
But if you can see this image here, and I can show my client the proof, and then if I say if you want to put this in your album, if you want to make a wall portrait, this is the image that I'm going to create for you. So again, not everything I do has to be overly painted, overly done, but it just neat to get the expressions on their face and how they're willing to, again, as funny as it sounds, pay you more money because they can't get this anywhere else. And I think that's financially, that's the biggest thing that we do, is being able to, once again, start out, great exposure, great image, and this other adding these things is really just the icing on the cake. I mean, many times, I don't know, when I'm shooting it, I'm not even thinking about enhancements. I'm just thinking about, can I get the great lighting? Then when I come back into the software, I'm like, wow, man, I'm going to spend as much time as I need to create something really cool. So I just invite you to, learn your craft of photography first, learn your lighting, learn exposures, and everything else, and you become a really great photographer. And then any filter you add on your great images is really can't be a bad filter.
Cool. Here's one more question, Frank, and this is also kind of on the business side, but it's more, and I like this question. How long did it take you to feel confident that you can do this? Like this is, photography. That's the thing as a wedding photographer. You said it. Everyone's a photographer today, and you get commissioned by a couple for their wedding, which is one of the most important days of their life, and you are. They're serious. You have a charge to make sure you get the best shots. So how long before you felt comfortable that you can do this consistently?
Now, is that question for the software end of this, or is this for the photography end of it?
I think the photography end of it.
The photography? Well, the photography end of it, the first 20-some years of my career, think about how funny this sounds, there was no such thing as a computer, right? So think about the energy we spend right now. I know I spend, learning softwares, and this sounds funny. It's like, well, of course, I still want to learn. I'm still looking and getting inspired by other work, so I'm still paying attention to the different lighting and again, compositions. I'm still constantly looking at that. But, think about having the first 20-some years of my career where all I could study and all I could go see was seminars on lighting, on different poses. That's all there was. So there was no such thing. We couldn't concentrate on any of that. So right now, even though we're all anxious to purchase softwares, I always invite you to, there's local schools, there's associations like WPPI you should go to every year, PP of A. I go to each year. I'm either teaching there or going there, and I still get inspired. But I just say just keep photographing. If you're a wedding photographer, you can go get a job with a photographer, as a second shooter. And what's happening nowadays is that people go buy the equipment and basically put up a $100 website and make the business cards, and all of a sudden they're in other words throwing their reel into the water to see if they can catch a fish. But the best result I ever had was I worked for 4 different photography studios, all doing weddings and portraits, and I got to see different approaches. But again, you've got to become a great photographer first. And you'll find that the effects for me, again, when I'm photographing a wedding, that's the last thing on my mind is the effects. I just want to make sure that they get the right expressions, the mood, the pose. And when I bring an image into Lightroom and export it into Photoshop and open up my onOne, man, it's like, wow. You know what I mean? I can just, sky's the limit. So, again, the length of time is really just keep photographing, and I think we've all did the same thing in our careers. We all ended up photographing our neighbor's wedding, right? Our friends' weddings, little small things. So, once you get clients looking at your work, listen to your clients. They'll dictate to you and say, wow, all the pictures you did look great, or, so that's how you learn. You just keep building that confidence by keep shooting. But lastly, again, educate yourself in photography. Learn how to use the camera. Learn how to use lighting. Learn your exposures. And your photography will be phenomenal. The software stuff is just going to really just separate you beyond that.